The children of Africa are still fast asleep and too busy running away from Africa.
Here's the thing about power. It doesn't waste time arguing with people who don't matter. It ignores them. But when someone starts speaking too close to the truth, suddenly the gloves come off. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao. This woman wasn't some outsider with a protest sign. She was the African Union's ambassador to the United States, the official face of Africa in Washington. Normally, that position means smiling, cutting ribbons, shaking hands, and making sure no one gets too uncomfortable. But instead, she grabbed the microphone and detonated the script. She said the unsayable, that Africa is still colonized, only now it comes wrapped in designer packaging. Think about it. Every year, leaders talk about Africa's bright future, about progress and partnerships. But behind those polite speeches, the deals are rotten. The contracts are written to keep African nations dependent. The currencies are manipulated. The resources are shipped out, leaving crumbs behind. Everybody in power knows this, but they depend on silence. Dr. Arikana refused to stay silent. She exposed France's control over the money of 14 African nations. She said out loud what many whisper. Western aid isn't charity, it's a leash. She pointed out how foreign embassies across Africa aren't just diplomatic offices, but centers of influence pulling strings behind the scenes. For speaking this truth, she wasn't celebrated, she was fired. Ask yourself, if she was spouting nonsense, why silence her? You don't fire clowns, you laugh at them. But they didn't laugh. They panicked. Because when she started saying these things on American soil, in front of American audiences, the mask began to slip. Africans already knew these truths. The danger was that the West's own citizens would hear them. That's the kind of threat elites can't tolerate. History is full of this pattern. Leaders who speak about true independence rarely last long. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. All of them spoke a language colonial powers feared most: sovereignty. Real independence doesn't just mean flags and national anthems. It means breaking the pipelines of wealth extraction. Dr. Arikana had the courage to remind the world that Africa is still being looted under the banner of freedom. That made her too dangerous. She didn't stop there. She called out USAID, pointing out that many African and even European leaders celebrate when this so-called aid agency leaves, because it has a history of meddling and backing opposition groups. She called the aid industry what it really is, a weapon. And then she pulled the curtain back on the biggest scam of the last century, the lie that colonialism ended. Yes, flags were raised and soldiers left. Independence days were celebrated, but the chains never came off. 14 African countries still use a currency created and controlled by France, the CFA franc. It sounds harmless, but it's a tool of domination. These nations are forced to deposit half their reserves in Paris. Imagine your salary automatically sent to someone else's bank, and you're only allowed to touch it if they approve. That's not freedom, it's financial slavery. France made sure that its former colonies would remain dependent forever. From currency and language to military training and equipment, everything was designed to keep control. Even today, France has the power to decide whether an African nation can access its own money. And it goes beyond money. France and other former colonial powers kept first rights on African resources. Uranium mined in Niger lights up French homes while Niger's people live in the dark. Oil pumped from Nigeria powers European cars while Nigerians queue for fuel. This isn't coincidence. It's the deliberate survival of colonialism under a new name. The genius of neocolonialism is that it no longer needs soldiers with bayonets. It hides behind paperwork, contracts, aid agreements, currency systems. Colonizers now wear suits and call exploitation partnership. The result is the same. Africa's wealth leaves, and Africa is told it's poor. Dr. Arikana stripped away the illusions. She asked the uncomfortable questions. If Africa still uses foreign-controlled currency, who is really in charge? If the resources still flow out to power other economies, who is truly independent? These questions are political dynamite. Because if enough people connect the dots, the entire illusion of post-colonial Africa falls apart. That's why Paris, London, and Washington would rather brand her as radical than admit she's right. And then she turned her fire toward the United Nations. On the surface, the UN looks like a symbol of peace and equality. Flags waving, leaders giving speeches, blue helmets keeping peace. But Dr. Arikana exposed the truth. The UN is not about equality. It's about control. Africa makes up more than a quarter of the UN's membership, 54 nations. Yet not a single one holds permanent power on the Security Council, the only body that makes binding decisions on war, peace, and sanctions. 5 countries, America, Britain, France, Russia, and China, hold that power. If all of Africa votes no, but one of those 5 votes yes, Africa loses. That's not democracy. That's a rigged game. And look at who holds the permanent seats. Britain and France, 2 fading European powers whose empires once exploited Africa. Their colonial grip may have loosened, but at the UN table, they're still seated while Africa remains locked out. The power structure of 1945 has never changed, even though the world has. Dr. Arikana's anger came from seeing this hypocrisy up close. She wasn't a professor speculating from a classroom. She was inside the system. She saw how Africa provided the soldiers, the battlegrounds, and the resources, while the decisions were always made elsewhere. That's not oversight, it's design. The UN was built to protect the interests of the powerful. Africa, despite being the most resource-rich continent on Earth, was never meant to have a voice. The result? Africa hosts more peacekeeping missions than anywhere else, yet has no permanent say in how peacekeeping is run. It's like being stuck in a courtroom where you're always the defendant, never the judge. This is why Dr. Arikana's message hit so hard. She tore apart the polite illusions of global politics and revealed what they really are. Colonial relics wearing modern uniforms. But she didn't just talk about problems. She talked about solutions. She placed hope in the African diaspora, the millions of people of African descent living abroad. For centuries, colonial systems tried to cut them off from the continent, feeding them lies about Africa being backward, keeping the brain drain flowing outward. But now that's changing. Africans abroad are reconnecting, sending money, investing, rediscovering identity. Dr. Arikana calls the diaspora Africa's secret weapon, because when Africans abroad mobilize, they bring skills, resources, and voices that bypass Western gatekeepers. A doctor in the US setting up a hospital in Ghana means fewer contracts for foreign NGOs. An engineer in Canada starting a plant in Nigeria means fewer European imports. Every reconnection weakens the grip of exploitation. History shows that whenever Black communities unite across borders, the system trembles. From Marcus Garvey to the Civil Rights Movement, unity has always been painted as dangerous because it is dangerous to the status quo. Dr. Arikana urges the diaspora: stop waiting for permission. Stop asking to be included. Africa doesn't need saviors, it needs its own children to come home. And here's the core of her message. Africa is not poor. Africa is the richest continent on the planet. Gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, cobalt, fertile land, endless sunlight, it has it all. What Africa doesn't have is sovereignty over its wealth. That's why poverty exists, not because resources are missing, but because they are stolen. Look at cobalt. 70% of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Without it, no smartphones, no laptops, no electric cars. The so-called Green Revolution is powered by Congolese dirt. Yet Congo remains one of the poorest countries on Earth. Why? Because the profits don't stay. They leave for corporations in Europe, America, and Asia. The same with oil. Nigeria exports millions of barrels daily, but its citizens stand in fuel lines. Ghana exports gold but struggles with poverty. The system is built to drain Africa while keeping Africans dependent. The media plays its role too, always showing starving children and dusty villages while ignoring the trillions extracted each year. That image of poverty justifies aid, keeps Africans dependent, and convinces the world that Africa can't survive without Western help. Dr. Arikana destroys that illusion. She insists that Africa doesn't need aid, it needs sovereignty. If Africa processed its own resources, built its own industries, and kept its profits, the so-called developed world would collapse. Imagine if Africa refused to export raw cobalt and demanded that companies build factories on African soil. The tech industry would grind to a halt. Imagine if uranium from Niger was reserved for African nuclear plants instead of French power stations. Europe would panic. That's why the myth of poverty is essential. Because if the truth spread that Africa fuels the world while being robbed, the system would collapse. Dr. Arikana says it plainly. Africa isn't poor. It's being robbed. And the ones calling her dangerous know she's telling the truth. Because when Africans wake up to the reality of their stolen wealth, the game is over. Her firing proves the point. She wasn't dismissed for being wrong. She was silenced for being right. Too right. So the question remains, is telling the truth the reason she was hated by the West? Or is it because her words could inspire a generation to stop begging for freedom and start taking it? The answer is clear. And that's why her voice echoes louder than ever.